I would like to introduce both Professor Earl Schwartz and Commissioner Harrington. They will both be coming in with dilemma stories for us to listen and respond to. I believe Earl is first. So Earl, go ahead and take it away.
I look forward to speaking with you this afternoon once again about the issues that we are exploring. And today I begin with a story of my own. In the course of preparing for today's session, I told the story I'm about to tell you to the planning group. And I relate it to you now because it came to shape the third policing dilemma Commissioner Harrington is about to tell you. I was told this story by the person who in the story is called Lieutenant Wayne Marshall. He gave me permission to include it in a book I wrote with Rabbi Barry Citron many years ago, entitled When Life is in the Balance. But he asked that we not use his real name in the book. And in subsequent conversations with Lieutenant Wayne Marshall, it became clear to me that though many years had passed since the events he described had occurred, the story I'm about to share with you continued to deeply trouble him in ways which I hope might help us to explore what a person in a comparable situation in the context of policing might experience. In June 1966, Lieutenant Wayne Marshall began his first tour of duty in Vietnam as a platoon leader of approximately 40 US Army infantry soldiers, most of whom were 18 to 20 years of age. One evening in November 1966, Lieutenant Marshall and his platoon set up an ambush approximately 1 mile from their base camp. This ambush was intended to put a halt to the periodic nighttime mortar barrages the base camp had recently suffered. These mortar attacks resulted in the deaths of several American soldiers, which had greatly angered and frustrated Lieutenant Marshall and his troops. The platoon was intent upon putting an end to the attacks before any more American lives were lost. The area where the platoon set their ambush was under a dusk to dawn curfew. This curfew had been established by the South Vietnamese government, which was working together with the Americans against the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese forces. Lieutenant Marshall and his platoon considered violators of the curfew suspect as enemy soldiers and therefore subject to attack by American forces operating in the area. The Americans set up their ambush along a road they thought might be used by the Viet Cong mortar group that had attacked their camp. The signal for springing the ambush was to be Lieutenant Marshall's detonation of a mine the soldiers had buried under the road. At approximately 4 a.m, Lieutenant Marshall heard a rumbling sound coming from some distance up the road. The Americans readied themselves for the ambush. Approximately 30 seconds after he first heard the rumbling, its source came into view: an old man and his ox cart. No more than 30 additional seconds would pass before the old man came to the place in the road where the mine was buried. As Lieutenant Marshall watched the old man approach, he pondered who this violator of the curfew might be. Perhaps a transporter of Viet Cong weapons or soldiers, a scout for the mortar group, or perhaps just an old woodcutter out to get a jump on his competitors. As he considered these possibilities, he weighed his options: spring the ambush, confront the man, thereby revealing his position to potential attackers in the vicinity, or allow the old man to pass, whoever he might be, and whatever he might be carrying in his ox cart. No more than a minute passed from the time Lieutenant Marshall first heard the old man and his ox cart approaching, till the moment he made his decision. And with that, I turn to Commissioner Harrington.
Thank you, Earl.
You're
I appreciate hearing the story again. I've heard it before from you, and it's still, I've got friends that were in some of those places, and so it brings me back to conversations I've had with them. I also want to thank all the folks from Interfaith, the leaders in the congregation for joining Interfaith, and with me and all the rest of this group for what I believe is some very, very important work. These sessions continue to add value and enlighten the many conversations with lawmakers that I've had. Interfaith action has been regularly mentioned, by the way. Perhaps your ears have been burning as I testified in the public safety committees in both the House and the Senate. And when I met with communities all over the state to talk about the violence we have seen, we've had 18 murders in St. Paul year to date, and there have been 35 murders in Minneapolis. And cities where you don't think about murder as being much of an issue, Richfield, Robbinsdale had a double the other day, and so many towns in greater Minnesota have had murders, and that's just the most heinous of the acts that we are seeing. These conversations were the basis of the proposals that Governor Tim Walz put forward, talking about the need for a yes and approach. He talked about needing both police reform and public safety. As we traveled the state from Duluth to Rochester, from New Ulm to Brooklyn Park, and from a lot of other places in between. I want you to know that this work and these conversations have meant a lot to me. They still mean a lot to me. It's personal to me for a lot of reasons, probably not the least of which is that I was Black long before I wore blue. And I don't forget, I haven't forgotten where I came from, and I haven't forgotten what my children are and my family and where my community lies in this really razor thin dichotomy between public safety and police reform and people being safe. These conversations are, I would argue, probably just the most recent step in what the Department of Public Safety has done in the last 3 years. And in fact, they were in no small part why I hired Nicole Archibald to come in as the first public affairs director for the department. We didn't have a public affairs. We didn't have an external facing component to the department before we got here, before Nicole. And in 2019, we brought Nicole in as the Attorney General. Keith Ellis and I led the Minnesota Working Group on Police-Involved Deadly Force Encounters, which after a year or so put forth recommendations. They were signed into law in July of 2020. And I note the date of that because it's after George Floyd. They were done before George Floyd, but they didn't get signed into law until the community's demand for reform was loud enough that the elected officials took notice of it. The impetus for that work came from leaders like you who had my ear and Keith Ellison's ear long before we were in our current positions. And I'll give you just a little insight that as much as that may sound historical, but last week I was over at the Mall of America with Valerie Castile and Greg Coleman and a group, Sherman Patterson, a bunch of other people have this program called Lights On, which I really would like to recommend to IFA to look at also. That's a sidebar here. And Valerie Castile testified, and I mean that in the most Baptist sense of the word, about the death of her son, Philandro. And we all, it was a room full of cops and a room full of community folks, and we listened and we learned from Valerie, we've learned from you And today I want to talk about deadly force, and it is a complicated topic. It was complicated when we started the conversation in 2019, when we learned that 50% of the cases involved someone who was in crisis. And I, once again, as you think about the impact of your words on me, think about the fact that we were proposing co-responder models so that mental health professionals would respond to people in crisis and not just cops. I think that's an important piece. It didn't pass through the legislature. That's another topic entirely. But that was our proposal, was to fund the co-responder models so that we could reduce that 50%. I know that crisis calls is not just the province of police, and all of you that are ministers have had your share of, I'm sure, scary moments where you're ministering to somebody who is not necessarily in touch with reality. It's surprising to me, and I appreciate the folks from Greater Minnesota that view these calls, and I've heard from many of you separate from the calls itself, that, because we know that 60% of the cases of deadly force by cops happen in Greater Minnesota. They don't all just happen in the cities, and I think that's a misnomer. During that first meeting, there are two things that I remember very clearly, and they were the voices of survivors. One group was there in disbelief and protest, quite honestly, that anyone would try and make a difference. And then what I most remember, though, was the voices of the moms, Valerie, and the mom who's lost her son in Oakland. Their voices were softer, but I would say their words were more powerful. And they told us that having this really hard conversation was, in fact, the right thing to do, because we have to stop this. This is maddening, and it is the definition of insanity. Much as I've asked you for help in creating recommendations for the future, I want you to know that a lot of the voices that you have brought me have been heard. In the state law is a provision that says that life is precious, that there's a sanctity to life, and that should be recognized by every cop. And that being afraid is not enough to pull a trigger and to end someone's life. That's now law. It's not proposed law. That's actually in state law, and it comes from these kinds of conversations. They're taking care of the families after the fact, and mandatory reporting, and additional funding for police training, and having body cams so that we can hold cops accountable when they do the wrong thing, and also so that we can give the families some peace and when they do the right thing, even if it's horrible. Loss of life is tragic, and I think Earl's example gives you a flavor of that, and what I'm going to tell you, which is my story of that kind of situation, could have been tragic, and I'm interested in your take on this. So this is my story. It's late after 9 p.m. or 2100 hours, as we would say it in the cop world. There's a one-man squad in St. Paul. He's dispatched to a prowler call, which means somebody is walking around somebody's house or walking around somebody's property, and somebody has seen that. It's on the east side of St. Paul. The caller is a woman with kids who has heard voices outside of her house and has seen someone standing in her bushes. Woman has been asked to stay on the phone as the officer drives to the call, and while still en route, the officer told the woman can see a light-skinned male dressed in dark clothes crouched beneath her window. Woman tells that she can hear voices next to her bedroom window on the first floor, and that she has kids. She's afraid. She thinks the person is going to break in. She's afraid he's going to break in. She's afraid for herself. She's afraid for her kids. And the dispatcher has now upgraded that call from a prowler call to a possible occupied burglary in progress. As the officer gets close to the house, he cuts his lights off. He stops the car a few houses away behind the house. He lets the dispatcher know that he's on scene, and he asks, is there backup coming? And this is one of those misnomers that most people have when you ask them, how many cops do you think is working at any given time? When I worked midnights on the east side, which is where this would have happened, there were 6 people at any given, on a good night, we had 6 people. But I can tell you that I talked to Charlie Adams, the inspector for the 4th precinct. That's all of North Minneapolis. On an average day, they have 4. And Minneapolis requires every officer to be in a 2-officer squad. So that means that's 2 cars for the entire 4th precinct. The dispatcher says the backup squad's still a ways away, and tells you the caller is getting a little more frantic. The caller can still hear voices. The caller can hear sounds. The caller is bringing her kids into the bathroom. The caller is afraid, and the panic is you can hear it in the dispatcher's voice. The officer walks around the back of the house. He can see a screen that's torn at the back of the house, but it doesn't look like the window's open. It's dark in the yard, and the officer can't see very well. And he's trying to make a decision. Does he wait and let his eyes adjust to the darkness? Or does he turn on his flashlight and light himself up, which if the person there is armed, could put him in immediate danger? As the officer walks around to the front of the house, he sees movement in a thick evergreen bush around the side of the house. He sees a human shape and he crouches down behind the steps. He turns on his flashlight and he can see sneakers at the base of the tree. The officer yells to the person to come out with their hands up. The officer still crouched down behind the steps where he's got some cover. At least he's got some concealment. And tells the person, come out slowly. He repeats it. He repeats it. And he repeats it. And he's yelling now, the officer is, hands up, get your hands up. Tells the person to come out slowly. And the person doesn't move. The officer can hear the person moving in the bushes. He can see the figure, and the figure has something in their hands, but you can't tell what it is. The object is dark, the bushes are dark, the person is dark, and now the person is moving. And the officer remembers what his training says, look for the hands, because the hands are where you're going to get killed. You look for the hands, you look for what's in the hands, because that's what can hurt you. The training officer reminded him that over and over again. And the officer is yelling now from behind cover, put your hands up, drop whatever's in your hands, drop it now, drop it now. And the person doesn't drop it. The officer can't tell what's in his hands, and the person is still moving. And the officer's wondering, how old is this person? He's not very big. What is in his hands? And why isn't he stopping? Why won't he put his hands up? Why won't he drop what he's carrying? The dispatcher's chirping in the officer's ear, asking if he's code 4. The officer tells him that he's not code 4. The scene isn't secure, that he's got one in front of him. And you can hear in the background the sirens as the other cops now start kicking into the gear to come and back up the officer who's there by himself. The officer's thinking, this is bad. This is bad. He's trying to remember his training. He's afraid, kneeling behind those steps. He's alone, and he's screaming now at the guy, get on the ground, get down now. And the person steps out of the bushes and turns towards the officer. Can he hear him? Doesn't he understand him? If he's carrying a gun, you can take a shot now. There's nobody behind the person. There's a clean shot if I take a shot right now. But what if? What if it's not a gun? What if it's not a knife? What if he's drunk? What if he's a kid? What if he's a rapist? What if he's a burglar? What if?